Welcome everyone at the guest lecture by Professor Jagiellonian from University of Florida. This lecture is organized by Institute for European Studies at Jagiellonian University and Monnet Network EU Cross as a part of a series of lectures that we are organizing within several institutions across the globe. The lecture will be on economic sanctions in the US-EU relations. Professor Zeldin is Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Florida. He was previously Deputy Secretary General for Policy at the NATO Parliamentary Assembly in Belgium, and he was also Director of Defense and Security Committee of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. He's also author of several books on national security, alliances. Professor Zeldin, thank you very much for coming and joining us, and for our students to be here. And the floor is yours for about 1 hour, and then followed by questions and answers.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Dziękuję. Dzień dobry. I see excited my Polish, so don't get excited. And if you have difficulties with my English pronunciation, I do come from the side of the country which is known for its incredibly lazy diction. So if that's a problem, just, ask me to repeat something. I'm happy to do that. It's a pleasure to be here at this very august university in an ancient place in Krakow. Coming from a state where basically we designate any building that survived the last hurricane as a historic structure. This is quite a difference, so it's quite a pleasure. But what I want to talk to you about today is economic sanctions in US-EU relations. And sanctions are something that I've studied for quite a while. I wrote a book on it a while back, and it's a really intriguing topic, I think. And I want you to sort of think about it in a couple of different ways. First, from an obvious sort of policy perspective, right? If you're interested in policy and international relations and foreign policy, it's kind of a critical question, right? How do states, and particularly the European Union, right, a massive economic power, how do they use their economic power to get what they want in the world? How can they use that economic power for non-economic means, or non-economic ends, I should say? Right. That's an interesting question. When and why does that work? From a theoretical perspective, if that's more the angle you want to go into, well, there's a couple of other interesting sort of theoretical questions that I think spin out of this. First off, we'll talk a little bit about how economic theory, right, applies to things that really involve politics and foreign policy, and where and when economic theory can actually try to impose its laws of economic behavior and utility maximization in politics in a way that might be predictable and aid policymakers in making decisions. And then also, I think, if you're interested in international relations theory, this, as we work through it, is a very interesting sort of dynamic that I think spells out some of the distinctions between, the effects of a more liberal, integrationist vision of international relations translated into foreign policy versus a more realist vision. Right? And I'll get into what I mean by that a little bit later. So, just to put the big points up front, right? I like to talk to questions, right? I don't always have answers for the questions, but I do like to throw them out there for you as points to consider. So, a couple of big questions that I think we need to answer before we can even start to talk about the US-EU relationship are some general questions about economic sanctions. First off, why do states use them? Right? Where do they fit, essentially, in the toolkit of states to get what they want in the international environment? Where are economic sanctions? Right? So why are they used? What are some of the differences between types of economic sanctions? We tend to use that term as sort of a blanket thing. But when you think about it, there are very distinct types of sanctions. And theoretically and in practice, they could have very distinct effects, some of which are not entirely obvious. We'll get into that a little bit later as well. A very important point, particularly if you're coming from a policy perspective, is, do economic sanctions work? Right? Do they actually help you achieve your goals? And in some cases, are they counterproductive? And is there anything that we can learn from either economic theory or other branches of social science that might help us predict when and why they would be effective and when and why they might be counterproductive? That would be an important point. And then we'll start to get into how sanctions fit into this very complex US-EU relationship. And I want to speak to two particular cases. The case of sanctions on Russia and the case of sanctions on Iran. And why those two? Well, they're good examples. Right? The first one is a case where the United States and the European Union are very much tied together, hand in glove, in imposing quite a comprehensive set of different kinds of economic sanctions on Russia. Whereas in the Iran case, we're really quite divergent, to the point that the EU is actually trying to undermine some of the sanctions the United States is trying to impose on Iran. So let's think about why and what that tells us about the foreign policy making process in these two, I won't say states, but entities. So that's roughly the roadmap of where we're going. Let me get to the first question, which is why use economic sanctions? And why in particular are they a very popular type of activity or tool used by the United States? Sanctions have been particularly used by the United States, I would argue, in the post-Cold War era. You can find dozens of examples, right? Whether it's Yugoslavia after it was breaking up, whether it's Iran, Libya, North Korea, a whole range of different types of sanctions that have been imposed. But in fact, it's a very long-standing practice of the United States government. In fact, you can go all the way back to some of the earliest aspects of American foreign policy. Sanctions were there. 1807, the United States decided to sanction Great Britain, a country from which it had only recently broken away from, and formed its own national government. Now, the issues were complex, and they eventually led to the War of 1812, which, if you know your American history, the British managed to come ashore and burn the capital, and a few more battles like that, and our current international situation may look a little bit different than what it does now. But nonetheless, sanctions featured prominently in that, and in fact, ultimately led to that violent conflict between Great Britain and the United States. And you can find dozens of other examples of the United States using economic pressure throughout its history, but particularly in the period after the Cold War. And I guess the question is why? Right? And I think you have to sort of think conceptually about this. So any state, whether it's a relatively powerful state or predominant, say it's the United States, or somewhat less so, there's a range of things that it can do to affect the international environment, a range of things that it can do to try and get what it wants out of the international system. Right? At one end, the sort of the lowest cost end, it has diplomatic means. It can talk, it can persuade, it can cajole, it can occasionally threaten, right? It can promise. It can try to use normative persuasion to try and get states to adhere to different policy positions or abandon some. At the other end of the spectrum, you have violence. You have warfare. Right? And if you've read your Clausewitz, you know that there's pretty much a straight line between these things. Right? All warfare has political goals at its end. But what tools do you use to get there? Right? What do you do when situations are beyond simple diplomatic demarches, but aren't appropriate to violent activities to try and resolve them? And that's where sanctions fit. They're in the middle. They're a middle option that gives you a certain degree of flexibility. So this has become, I would say, a go-to option for American foreign policy in a lot of these situations where clearly violent conflict to resolve the situation is not appropriate or not desirable. Right? No one, for example, in either the European Union or the United States is willing to go to war with Russia over what's going on in Ukraine. But clearly it demands something more than purely diplomatic condemnation. This is where sanctions fit. So, for the United States, being that it is a massive economic player in the international environment, producing roughly a quarter of the global GDP, and also a huge consumer of the world's goods, its ability to use that economic power to either restrain goods going to a country or deny another country its markets, that can be quite potent. So for the United States, this has become, as I said, kind of a go-to option. And it's a way to sort of use this massive economic power for broader security ends, or broader political ends. So that, I think, sort of covers basically why, and why we see so much of it. Let's talk a little bit about the different kinds of sanctions out there. Because we tend to use this term as sort of a one-size-fits-all kind of thing. It's not. So let's break this down in sort of four basic categories that should be fairly self-explanatory, but what I want to walk through later on is how these different types of sanctions can have very different kinds of effects. And we can predict those, and we can probably adjust our sanctioning behavior based on those. So first off, export sanctions. You can block the flow of goods from your state, the sender state, to a targeted state. You can block them comprehensively. You can select weapons or dual-use materials, whatever you want, but you can do things that say, we will not sell to you, right, because of what you're doing. And until you change your behavior, this normal market relationship will not resume. Now, the flip side of that, of course, is import sanctions, right? Saying, we will not buy stuff from you until your behavior changes. Now, these two are often used together, but not always. Right? Sometimes the emphasis is put on one or the other for different reasons. We will get into that in just a minute in the examples. Another very popular area of sanctions doesn't involve goods at all, but rather involves financing. So you can have different kinds of financial sanctions. One thing that you can do is block the ability of the central banks of a targeted country to borrow money internationally. That can be very potent. Or at least block their ability to borrow at preferential rates from certain institutions, which can cost them money in a very real way. And that can also be extended to different entities that are either state-owned corporations or particular companies that are involved in activities that we wish to condemn. For example, many of the companies that are involved in the Russian arms industry are blocked under financial sanctions at the moment. And then finally, there's this area of what you can call smart sanctions. The idea of smart sanctions is to target the economic pain directly on the influential individuals in a government or in a governing circle who make the decisions and you try to block their access to the money which they have squirreled away in foreign banks and their ability to travel. And the idea is you impose that pain directly on those individuals who can make the decisions, and you hope to shift their opinions based on their own economic, rational interest and cost-benefit calculations. This is an attempt to try to get away from the idea that sanctions are kind of a big hammer that's used to punish an entire country, instead of trying to punish a population which may not be in alignment with what its leadership is doing, trying to focus the pain very much on the people who make the decisions. So that's kind of your range of different kinds of sanctions. Let's ask ourselves some other questions. So, do sanctions work? I don't know, what do you think? Show of hands. Sanctions, generally an effective tool of foreign policy, or not? Effective. Oh. One effective person.
It depends.
It depends. Excellent, excellent. You stole my next line. Okay, yes. It depends a lot. It actually depends on what you mean, right? Because if y'all don't believe that sanctions don't work at all, I guess there's not much point to any of this lecture at all, right? We should all go away. But nonetheless, countries still keep using sanctions, which raises some interesting questions. Why, if they're not so effective much of the time? And in fact, if the model in your head is a sort of a relatively simple one, which is externally imposed economic pain will lead to policy changes in that targeted country to end the economic losses, right? That a government will rationally weigh the costs and benefits and say, well, we're losing money from these sanctions. It's way more than what we're gaining from the policies we're pursuing. Therefore, we will eliminate those policies and go back to a normal trading relationship. If that's the model in your head, then yes, they don't work very often. That doesn't usually happen that way. And in fact, probably the largest comprehensive study of this was by three people, Hofbauer, Schott, and Elliott. Massive 2-volume tome with hundreds of case studies in it. Basically comes up with, sanctions rarely achieve these sort of big policy changes on their own. But that last part, on their own, is a very important, I think, qualifying phrase there. Because sanctions can do a lot of other things that do push you in the right direction towards your policy goals. One thing is they set an important set of signals out there. Because when you impose sanctions on another state, there's a certain cost to you. Right? So, for example, if you impose sanctions, I'm going back to the Cold War period, the United States at a time put sanctions on Russia and blocked sales of wheat and soybeans to the Soviet Union for a time period, it's right around 1980, 81. That's going to hurt American farmers, at least temporarily. They're going to complain to the representatives. You in Washington are going to have to justify that policy. You're going to have to take care of those complaints. You're going to be taking on political heat for this for some time. Someone will be losing out when you disrupt that trade, and they're going to complain about it. So clearly, you as a state sending sanctions on another country, imposing them on another country, there will be some cost to you. That cost is important because it sends a signal. We are willing to bear some cost ourselves to do this to you. Therefore, this issue is important, and you need to pay attention to it, or there may be further action. So the signaling game in all this is quite important, I think, to think about. You also need to think about sanctions as a constraining factor. They may not change behavior in the exact way that you want, but they can deprive countries that are hit with sanctions of certain resources which they could use to keep pursuing those policies. Right? They may be at an economic disadvantage. They may not be able to borrow money internationally. That may make it more difficult for them to finance their military. They will find it more difficult to buy weapons from foreign countries, and therefore will have to do it less, and that may make them do or make decisions that don't make the crisis any worse than it already is. Some evidence from some people that that may be a factor in how Russia's been thinking about some of its actions in the Donbass region right now. So, if you take it all together, there isn't a clear, nice, linear relationship between economic pain that is imposed through sanctions and policy changes. But there's something going on in the middle that's interesting. And I think that's why countries continue to use economic sanctions even though they don't necessarily lead directly to the goals they want all the time. In fact, if you think about the cases where sanctions are effective, where you can actually trace it back and say, yep, the sanctions led to that decision and it's what we wanted, they're usually pretty small-scale things. It's stuff like, well, this country expropriated a bunch of American property and factories, we imposed sanctions, and a few weeks later they said, yeah, maybe this isn't such a good idea, and they reversed that decision. Not a huge deal, but effective. And the reason here is that that issue wasn't terribly important to the target state. It wasn't a fundamental issue. They could surrender it without a lot of cost. But it is extremely difficult to try and force a targeted state to change its behavior with economic pressure if that issue is really of critical importance to it. If there is something related to its identity or its fundamental interests, you're not going to get this to happen with economic pressure. So, for example, Serbia, 1999, sanctions over its activities in Kosovo. There was honestly no amount of economic pressure that was going to push the regime of Slobodan Milosevic to abandon what they were doing in Kosovo. Why? This was fundamental to his regime. It was fundamental to the identity that he had created for a Serbian nation, this sort of mythical heartland in Kosovo. It was a fundamental, Kosovo is a fundamental and critical part of Serbia by their reckoning. There's no way that that's going to be forced out through economic pressure. That's going to take something different. So, you tend to find that there are distinct limits to what sanctions can do. And while they may push you in a certain direction, in the right direction, it's got to be done with a lot of other things as well. There's another factor to consider. Not just when sanctions are effective or not effective, what about when they're counterproductive? What about when they actually make it harder for you to get what you want and put you further away from your goals? Well, let's think about how that can happen. The first kind of sanctions I mentioned were export sanctions, blocking the flow of goods to a particular country. Let's sort of think about that in purely sort of economic terms, what happens in that case. So if I block the flow of goods to a particular country, I'm essentially giving them or creating for them the equivalent of a protective tariff that will protect their domestic industries that are capable of producing the goods which I am no longer selling to them. Keep in mind, many countries are capable of producing a wide range of products. They don't do so because it's cheaper and more efficient to import them. Right? This is the basis of international trade. So, if you block those goods, and they have the industrial capacity to make them, now they will. And so what you get in many of these cases is the rise of domestic industries that would not be there without the economic sanctions. Give you one example of this. South Africa. South Africa, 1970s, 1980s, under pretty stringent multilateral, UN-enforced sanctions to try to force the white minority regime to back away from the policies of apartheid, liberalize in terms of granting rights to the majority black population. Went on for a very long time. But one of the critical things about those sanctions was saying, you, South Africa, you're repressing your population. We will not send to you or sell to you anything that can be used in that way. any police gear, any military gear, any armored personnel carriers, any weapons of any kind. You're blocked. Well, South Africa had a pretty good industrial base. So what do you think they did? They started making their own, right? And they got good at it really quickly. In fact, the government-owned corporation in South Africa that produced weapons, Arms Corps, got so good at this that they actually started to export it. Think of a source of export earnings. Ironically, mostly to sub-Saharan Africa. But they became, by the early 1980s, the 6th largest exporter of arms in the world. They didn't have that industry 10 years earlier. Well, think about what the political effects of that are. That industry is now employing tens of thousands of people directly. Right? People are making money. People have jobs. There's a lot invested in this. And all those people know that if sanctions go away, so does all that. Because it would be much easier and much cheaper to import all that stuff than it is to do it domestically. So, logically, it makes sense for them to become politically active to make sure that the source of what causes the sanctions stays in place. And you can find a fair amount of evidence that shows that that's exactly what happened. It may have actually made it harder to change policies in South Africa. Serbia is another good example of this. Serbia was under pretty stringent economic sanctions over its activities in Bosnia in the 1990s. One of the things that the international community did was block the flow of oil and gasoline to Serbia. Well, smuggling networks arose to get that gasoline into Serbia. Those smuggling networks earned huge amounts of money off this. And they also became some of the largest supporters, very directly, of the militias that were operating in Bosnia, doing some of the most horrific ethnic cleansing, and became a critical part of the Serbian Radical Party, which was actually pushing for more radical policies than even what originally Slobodan Milosevic was pushing for. So in a way, you may have enriched a constituency and given it a vested interest to become politically active to ensure that sanctions would stay in place. That is counterproductive. So we need to be very careful, I think, when we look at sanctions. Think about the different effects and use them in a very careful manner so that we do not end up in this sort of position. All right, so that I think has covered sort of a basic introduction to sanctions, if you will, right? Sort of what we're actually talking about in terms of sanctions, why states use them, right? Where they sort of fit on the continuum of actions that states can possibly do to get what they want in the international environment, and a little bit about their potential effects and counter-effective effects. So let's now take what's left of this time and talk to how sanctions fit into this US-EU relationship, which is an enormously complex relationship. Okay? I mean, there's, 2 billion euros worth of trade that goes back and forth across the Atlantic. We own more of each other's companies than anyone else. So in terms of direct and indirect investment, we own more of each other's debt than anyone else. Our sovereign debt. In addition to that, you've got the transatlantic security relationship through NATO, which is the longest going, most deeply integrated security network that's ever been devised. So you have this complex, multifaceted, very tight relationship. And economic sanctions fit into this in a way, both a positive and a negative way. And at the end, I will give you perhaps my opinions on how this can be improved. Because sanctions aren't just part of the U.S. foreign policy toolkit. They're part of the EU toolkit as well. They have been, actually, since before the Common Foreign and Security Policy. One of the first things that the EU did, going back, I think, to the London Conference in 1980, right, was sort of give the EU the ability to discuss the use of economic sanctions as a way of projecting European power and interests. And this all makes sense as the EU tries to become a more competent and potent international actor. Because after all, what is the power of the EU? It's economic. I mean, primarily, that's what it comes down to. The EU is a major weight in the international economy, is a huge consumer of the world's goods. That gives it a lot of power. And it's also a huge producer, particularly of high value-added goods and specialty goods. Right? And if you can cut off the flow of those at different times, that can have a dramatic effect on certain countries at certain times. So if you think about this in a transatlantic context, if you can actually get the United States and the European Union in sync on this, and how to use sanctions and where and when to use them, that could exert an enormous amount of pressure in the international environment on particular countries, right? Because combined, you're talking about half of the world's gross domestic product. That's enormous, right? Can that be harnessed in a way that works in our interests? So it's worth exploring why the relationship works in some cases and why it doesn't in others. And to do that, I'd like to spend the rest of the time sort of talking through two case studies. One where it works, and we're definitely on the same page, that is sanctions with Russia. And one where it's not working out very well at all, and that deals with the case of Iran. So let's work through those stepwise here. So let's talk about sanctions on Russia. Here you have the United States, the European Union, and Canada have all come together to impose really quite coordinated and complementary sanctions on Russia. And there's a range of reasons for doing this, right? You have, obviously, the activities in the Crimea, the annexation of the Crimea. That's the beginnings of this. But then also Russia's ongoing actions in the Donbass region and eastern Ukraine is another factor. The Kerch Strait incident is another factor that aroused yet more sanctions. So since 2014, there have been different steps of sanctions that have been imposed by both the European Union and the United States. And they all revolve around certain particular points. In addition, I forgot to mention there are sanctions that involve the assassination attempt in Great Britain, as well as Russian cyber intrusions in the United States. So, if you look at American sanctions, and I'm not going to go through the whole list and what's on everything, they're complex and they are multi-layered. Right? And you will find bits and pieces coming out of the Department of Treasury and State and Commerce. And there's a distinct sort of pattern here, and I think it breaks down in certain ways. And I think you will start to discern the points of pressure the United States is trying to exert. First off, there are extensive targeted sanctions on particular individuals in the Russian governing elite. They have been selected, named, pinned, and pressure is being put on them, making it very difficult for them to access their foreign-based assets, making it very difficult for them to travel, and generally trying to put pressure on those people who are close to the inner circle of Vladimir Putin. And like I said, there's a wide range of people here. One that stuck out in my mind is Viktor Ozerov, who's the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee of the State Duma in Russia. It only struck me when I read this because I know him. Because back when there was a Russian delegation to the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, he was a leader of it. So he's not doing that anymore, and in fact, he's probably not doing a lot of travel outside of Russia because of these sanctions. Also, people who are big financiers of Russia, who are closely tied to government. People like Yuri Kovalchuk, who's the largest shareholder in Bank Rossiya, but also others who have been closely tied to Vladimir Putin, who have benefited a lot from the Putin regime. Think about particularly the Rotenberg brothers, and also members of the inner political circle around Putin. People like Sergei Ivanov. So these have been selected, and they've been picked and targeted. And the idea is that these people will experience difficulties. These people will be inconvenienced. And that they, in their private interactions with each other and with the state leadership, will come to different conclusions about what is really valuable. Right? So one can picture in this sort of situation, well, damn it, my bank accounts in Britain are now frozen, and how am I going to pay for my kids' school fees at that exclusive private school out in, somewhere in southern England? And, come on, Vladimir, do we really need to be doing this? Is there a way we can kind of loosen this up so I don't have to get dinged with this? That's what they're hoping for, right? Enough people in that circle to be inconvenienced, pained at some level, that it starts to foment a bit of a mutiny within the inner circle. That's the idea. Beyond that, you have sanctions that are designed to target the assets of Russian companies, in particular, companies that are state-owned companies that do defense-related issues. So there are about 5 big ones. Those companies are prohibited from doing business with American entities. They cannot buy from them. They cannot sell with them. There's no technology transfer. That's gone. So that's designed specifically to harm the Russian defense industry and make it more difficult for it to pursue its military activities, although clearly Russia has a very large and developed and sophisticated defense sector as it is. The next part, which I want to come back to in a little more depth, is there have been pretty stringent sanctions from the United States on exports that relate to its oil and gas extraction sector. So the Treasury Department imposed sanctions that prohibit the exportation of goods and services or technology in support of exploration or production for Russian deepwater, Arctic or offshore, or shale energy projects, and that includes Gazprom, Lukoil, Rosneft, all the major companies. Why is that significant? Well, because most of the big technological advances of late in shale oil drilling and other experimental deepwater techniques have come out of the United States. That technology cannot go to Russia. There cannot be assistance from American companies in any way or partnership with those Russian companies. It will make it very difficult for them to develop that industry and exploit those resources that they have beyond where it already is. So that's an important kind of sanction, and I want to sort of tie that into a second issue a little bit later. But first, let's talk about EU sanctions, okay, and where they're different, where they're really pretty complementary with the United States. One of the things the EU is focused on here is really trying to block the access of Russian banks and companies to EU financial centers. So both primary and secondary markets, but to really make it very difficult for Russian companies and corporations to raise capital in Europe. And that's important. On top of that, there's been a blanket ban on export of weapons and dual-use items to Russia from European companies, as well as a ban on imports from Crimea. That's pretty symbolic, but nonetheless important. And then finally, there are targeted sanctions, very much in the same way that the United States is using them, but the list is much more extensive. So we're looking at 170 individuals who are involved in those targeted sanctions. It's a more extensive list than what the United States has put out. Many of the people are on the same ones, but clearly the EU is trying to sort of push the targeted sanctions down even further into the sort of decision-making structure and try and cultivate a sense of economic disruption at a personal level to a wider range of individuals involved in the Russian foreign policy process. So one area, though, that I think needs some discussion and fleshing out, of course, is this idea of the Russian energy sector, because this is an area actually where not just the United States and Europe may have some disagreements, but actually there's some real inter-European disputes. Because you have, for example, Germany engaging in trying to build Nord Stream 2 with Russia, a cooperative project that would allow gas to flow from Russia under the Baltic to Germany, or actually paralleling an existing pipeline and developing and doubling the size of that. This is controversial. Obviously, many Central European countries look upon this quite skeptically. The United States does as well, and is in fact threatening to sanction German companies that are working with Russian companies in constructing this. So this has become a fractious issue, I think, not just in sort of a transatlantic sense, but also in an intra-European sense. So I'd like to sort of talk a little bit about the energy situation in Europe, how Russia relates to that, and where the United States relates to this, because this has become part of American policy and strategy. And while it's not specifically about economic sanctions, it is about using economic pressure in concert with these other things to try and push policy in different directions. I'm not sure how well that shows up at the back of the room. Basically, all this shows you is that over the last 3 years, since the middle of 2016, the amount of U.S. liquefied natural gas, LNG is liquefied natural gas, being exported from the United States has gone up tenfold, from 1 billion cubic feet per day to 10. And it's going to double again in the next 3 years. This is huge. This is a massive market shift, right? Turning the United States into, at that point, the single largest exporter of natural gas in the world. Now, here's the thing. We'll go to the side. So Russia is still the single largest supplier of gas to Europe. 38-39% that comes from Russia. The other two big players are Norway and Algeria. And actually, liquefied natural gas coming from the United States is a relatively small part of all that. 20%, 15% in that range. And the reason is simply price. It costs money to liquefy natural gas and ship it across the Atlantic. Not as much as you might think. You know, the difference in cost between, say, gas coming from the U.S. and gas coming from Russia, it's about a 17% difference. It's something, but it's not enormous. So right now, American natural gas goes mostly to Asia and Latin America because that's where the price, where people are willing to pay that price because they don't have cheap Russian gas as an alternative. But think about what happens if Russia chooses to try to block that flow, as it did in, say, 2005 or 2009, when it was able to play these games with energy supplies, right? And really arouse quite a lot of alarm in much of Europe about its dependence on Russian natural gas. Well, if you try to raise the price dramatically, you could probably raise it 5 or 10%, but once you get beyond that, it starts getting very close to the price of LNG, and the price of that is actually falling because of developing technologies and economies of scale in the export sector. So, yeah, you got maybe a 10% window to raise prices. It's not so much. If you try to cut off supply for political means or political ends, American natural gas can fill that capacity very, very quickly. Right? Why? Back to the slide here. Wow. Okay. You'd have to imagine that slide. That one didn't duplicate very well. Well, what that is a map of Europe showing you all the liquefied natural gas facilities and the ones that have just been constructed. There are new ones that have been constructed in Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, Bulgaria. There's also huge underutilized natural gas, liquefied natural gas capacity in Spain and in France. And one of the things the EU has done under its energy strategy is ensure that the gas can move west as well as move east. It seems like an obvious point, but it actually was technically had to be done. It's not a simple thing. So if you actually had a gas cutoff, right, you can fill that with American natural gas. There's tremendous capacity to bring that stuff in, fill up those pipelines, move it east as well as west. Not a problem at all. So the end result, if Russia wants to play those games, it could try. All it's going to do is lose market share. So essentially, and this, by the way, is primarily being done by the private sector, but the U.S. government has been actively encouraging this, right? Fast-tracking and greenlining a lot of the plants that are doing this liquefied natural gas stuff and allowing them to be constructed rather quickly, because obviously a lot of these things can be held up by regulation. That's being essentially fast-tracked, right? There's a clear political undertone to this, and it's about fitting in with these sort of sanctions on Russia. So it's not really a part of sanctions, but it's a clear use of economic pressure to try and limit Russian influence. Right, so that's sort of the Russia case, where here you have really the European Union and the United States pretty much side by side. After all, I mean, for the first time, the United States is really saying, look, in its national security strategy, it's labeling Russia as a serious geopolitical challenger. And it is working very closely with the European Union on this issue in a variety of different ways. So clearly, we've been able to establish a strong relationship there. Let's take a case where this has failed. And then let's ask ourselves why, because I think that provides some interesting questions. And then I'll try and wrap up with a little bit of commentary on my own. I guess we're kind of running low on time here. So, all right, so let's just talk briefly about the sanctions on Iran. I don't need to go into a lot of details on the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the so-called nuclear deal, signed in 2015 between the EU, the US, and Iran. And the deal here is basically this, right? So there is some monitoring of Iranian nuclear facilities, Korea in particular. There's a partial shutdown of some of the fast-spinning centrifuges that are used to produce weapons-grade uranium. And in exchange for that, in exchange for these things that should limit the speed at which Iran can develop a nuclear weapon, Iran got relief on sanctions immediately in the banking sector, on shipping, and on commercial activities that would allow it to import a wide range of products. It also got a certain amount of cash paid to it from the United States. And the hope here was very much one along the lines of sort of liberal interdependence theory in international relations put into policy. We will, collectively, the EU and the United States, we will rope in Iran into this web of commercial interactions which will benefit it. And it will not want to sacrifice those benefits by engaging in activities that will imperil them or certainly spark conflict. Right? It will not want to do that. It will not be in its rational interest, and this will eventually make Iran more of a quote-unquote normal country. As I said, this is a key part of thinking from sort of a liberal interdependence school in international relations. Okay? And it's based on, probably the clearest maximum one can have in business, which is don't shoot your customers, right? And don't bomb your suppliers, right? These things are bad for business. So if you have a lot of business, right, and a lot of commercial interaction, you have a lot of good interest to avoid conflict. So this is the idea, right? And this was, I think, part of the EU's framework on things, which is not surprising because the entire model of the European Union is based on the idea of economic interdependence being woven into the system to prevent conflict between states, if you go back to the earliest years of the European Union. And it's certainly a strand of thought in American foreign policy making, and one that was highly prevalent during the Obama administration, which was constructing this deal. But ultimately, a couple of things started to fall out of all this in the years that came out of this. While in some cases Iran was living up to the letter of the agreement, there were things it was violating on testing different kinds of missile technology, but more importantly, Iran seemed to be using the influx of capital that was coming out of this deal to engage in even more destabilizing activities in the broader region. So some things that came up that were particularly problematic its backing of terrorist groups in the broader Middle East, its support of the rebel Houthi forces in Yemen, and really engaging in a conflict with Saudi Arabia for greater influence in the Arabian Peninsula. And probably most significantly, its support for the Bashar al-Assad regime in Syria that is responsible for so much of the misery there that is driving these huge population flows towards Europe, these migration flows towards Europe, which are so problematic as well. Not to mention the ongoing longer-range missile tests, and while doing that, threatening Israel with its eventual destruction. Plus, we then found out later that Iran was really not very truthful in its declaration of its past nuclear programs. All this comes together, and the current American administration, the Trump administration, cancels its participation in the deal. And it's able to do this because the original deal was never run through the Senate. It was never made a treaty. It was simply an executive order signed by the president and then had to be renewed, I think, every 6 months. And so a president, the next president, can simply refuse to sign it, and it dies. And that's what happened. So that put us into this position now where the United States is out of it, and the EU is still in. But the United States just doesn't go for backing out of that deal. It goes to reimpose sanctions in a different way and to exert what it is calling maximum pressure on Iran. Particularly focusing on the ability of Iran to export their oil, which is the vast bulk of their export earnings. So there were about 8 countries that were still, last year, that were still importing Iranian oil. The United States put intense diplomatic pressure on all of them to stop doing that. I think it's now, of those 8, I think 6 have agreed to stop importing Iranian oil. China and 1 other, I think, still are. So that's been fairly effective. And the question is where that's going to lead to. But this has become a huge problem in U.S.-EU relations. And there's a couple of problems here that come up that are particularly important. One is that the United States is also threatening to block EU companies that trade with Iran from doing business in the United States. This is so-called extraterritorial or third-party sanctions. In fact, there's a bipartisan bill in, I think, in the Senate right now that deals with this. So if that happens, and the United States has tried to do this before, it did so in the 1990s over sanctions on Iran and Libya, it's highly problematic in international law because essentially what you're saying is that we're going to apply U.S. law to entities, private entities, in other sovereign countries and punish you for not abiding by that law. That's a very difficult thing to do in international law, and it obviously raises great consternation in the European Union. It's unlikely that it will actually happen that way, but the threat of it out there certainly creates a tense and hostile environment between the United States and the EU over this point. The other point that's worth mentioning is that the EU, for its sake, is absolutely determined to maintain the nuclear deal. And in fact, it's been attempting to create financial tools that would allow Iran to essentially subvert American sanctions and still work and trade in the European Union. And that, I think, opens up an interesting question of why. Why do that when, in fact, Iran's activities are problematic for European Union interests as well? I mean, as I mentioned before, Syria is a huge problem for the European Union just by the flow of refugees it's created. Iran and Iran's special forces have been instrumental in propping up the regime there and terrorizing the civilian population. This is a clear problem for the EU. There's also Iranian covert operations ongoing in Europe. So last year you had several assassinations in the Netherlands by Iranian agents, as well as some other activities that were highly problematic, I think, in Germany. So there's any number of reasons why one would expect the European Union as an institution would be highly upset with Iranian activities and want to pursue sanctions. But in fact, they're really trying to find ways to sort of get around the sanctions regime. And all of this is leading to a really fractious relationship with the United States on this. And I think what's going on here is that the European Union is taking a more narrow and sort of legalistic interpretation of the deal with Iran. Saying, look, this is about the nuclear project of Iran. That's the deal that was signed. By and large, Iran is living up to the terms we have signed. So sanctions should not be reimposed. The United States, I think, is taking a broader sort of view of Iran as a geopolitical problem that must be solved. That is one that is becoming increasingly problematic in the region, and it's one that has to be dealt with in a more comprehensive way. But the nuclear side of this is only one part of a much larger problem. I think the EU is viewing the situation and Iran as an actor to be managed through engagement. So you really have sort of, I think, competing visions of international relations based on very different theoretical perspectives, right? One far more realist, one far more sort of liberal integrationist, and there's a clash there, a fundamental clash there at this point. Two, let's not ignore that there is a fair amount of money at risk in this. SA Total, Airbus, there's some potentially big money to be made in Iran there, both in upgrading the Iranian oil development infrastructure, as well as upgrading the Iranian air fleet. But finally, I think there's really a more important issue here. It gets beyond those things, which is this deal, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, was negotiated with the European Union as an institution, right? Front and center. This was a point of pride. It is something that an enormous amount of political capital has been invested in. If the European Union abandons that because the United States has, it says, oh, well, you know, they pull out, and I guess we'll pull out too. It calls into question the existence of an independent European Union foreign policy that is distinct and different from that of the United States. That's a very large political issue. I think for those reasons, it's important for the European Union to maintain its involvement in this agreement, despite the fact that there are a lot of issues that the EU can identify as things that would merit sanctions upon Iran for its activities. Nonetheless, this has led to, as I said, a pretty fractious relationship between the United States and the EU. So let me sort of wrap this up with a few thoughts and how we might perhaps get around some of that. So the first point here is that sanctions can be a very constructive part of this European-U.S. relationship. There's such an enormous amount of economic capacity built into this. If the two sides are working in sync together, you can exert considerable amount of economic pressure on targeted states, or states that have stepped outside the bounds of what is agreed to be standard international procedures. The sanctions may not work in and of themselves, right? But they will push you closer towards the goals that you want to get to. They can send important signals. They can constrain states. And they're going to fill a gap in policies where you may not have other good options. Once again, we may all agree that Russia's actions in Ukraine need to be confronted, need to be dealt with. But nobody in a leadership position in the United States or the European Union looks at that as a situation where they're willing to risk a war with Russia. That's not in the cards. So sanctions can fill that middle ground, and if we can work together and coordinate, that kind of pressure can eventually push us in the right direction. I'd like to point out here, sort of following from Robert Cohen and his, discussions about interdependence. Disagreement in international relations doesn't necessarily mean that cooperation is impossible. Right? In fact, cooperation happens when there is disagreement. If you have harmony of interest, there's no need to cooperate and compromise and discuss. You simply have the same interests. So it's points where you have disagreements that you need cooperation, and cooperation arises in different ways. And so here, I think, in this, and this is me sort of editorializing at this point, I think this is an opportunity for the United States and the European Union to sort of sit down and think about this in a far more cooperative way in dealing with the situation with Iran, rather than the sort of confrontational direction that we're both taking at the moment. And the compromise can look like something like this. Okay, the nuclear agreement stands. And there's no sanctions related to that. But there can't be sanctions related to all these other activities. Right? Whether it's support for different terrorist groups, whether it's assassinations in EU member countries by Iranian agents, whether it's support for the Assad regime, which is sending this whole destabilizing wave of individuals towards the European Union with obvious negative political effects. So we can work out compromises in those ways that may not be perfectly satisfying for everyone, but would enable us to use the combined economic power of the European Union and the United States in a far more constructive way than is happening right now. Finally, I'll just say that here's the basic reality, is that the United States and the EU, for all of our differences, we are both fundamentally the same in that we are status quo powers. We do very well out of the existing international order, and we want it to stay that way. We want predictability in the international environment and stability, and we want to do things that will minimize the ability of other states to challenge that. So we should be united in trying to block the revisionist aims of Russia. We should be, and I didn't even mention China, we should be united as a front in trying to block China's ongoing abilities to undermine international agreements about intellectual property and other things that relate to that, because most of that intellectual property originates in the European Union and the United States. It's fundamentally in our interest to do so. We should be united in pressuring Iran to act more responsibly and not behave in a manner that fans the flames of conflict in a volatile region that is really quite close to Europe. So, sum up, we may not always like it, but we're actually each other's best partners in this regard, and economic sanctions could be a very constructive part of using this relationship for our mutual foreign policy goals. So with that, I'm going to stop, and I will take any questions you have.
Thank you very much for the presentation. With no delay, I'm opening the floor. We have. Do you want to collect questions, or can we go like ping-pong style?
I mean, I guess we can collect questions at first.
Okay.
Do a lot of people have questions, or just one or two?
I think they will have, but that's obviously
okay, we'll start with you, and then if we need to, we'll collect.
Yeah, okay, good.
I can ask like a lot of questions if you.
Sure.
Please speak up, because this room has the.
Okay. I have a question actually about if sanctions on Russia really work, because this was a report in Bloomberg, I guess 1 month ago, about the Senate, and that they have no doubts about sanctions on Russia, because 5 years passed and they haven't stopped the activity on Donbass and in Crimea, and they even built a breach there. And they also sent the troops to Venezuela and in Syria again, and working with North Korea.
Yep.
So
the sanctions work.
It looks like they're kind of tired of this. And again, Germany, with the United States threatening them to impose sanctions on their companies for this oil pipe. I guess. Yeah. And does it really work?
Well, I mean, I think you sort of answered the question in your question. No, not directly. And that's I guess one of the points I was trying to make. You rarely see, this direct relationship of sanctions are imposed and then the policies change. But what happens over time is that you are minimizing the resources the Russian state is going to have available. Think about how much money, where the Russian state gets its money from. So now the oil sector and the energy development sector in Russia, it's very difficult to invest in that, right? Putting aside the German involvement in Nord Stream 2. So it's difficult to help Russian companies with new technology to develop that. That means that sector is declining. With the declining price of fuel, that means the money available to Russia is going down, 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 down. So its inability of its major defense companies to interact with Western companies or get financing means that things are going to be slower for them to develop new products or expand at all. All these things over time induce certain costs. And then eventually, governments have to make choices about, in a cost-benefit way, where does this balance out? In addition to that, you've got the targeted sanctions on the individuals, right? Which is putting pressure on them personally. It's not destroying them, but it's making their life difficult. Over time, will that start to lead to changes? Will it start to lead to people talking amongst themselves in that inner circle around Putin saying, is this really worth it? You know, should we really be pushing for something a little different? So I'm not saying it's going to change things overnight, right? But over time, you are putting pressure, you're sending signals. You combine that with, say, now, at least from the American perspective, much more robust military support to Ukraine, and the picture starts to shift a little bit, right? So it may not stop Russia from the existing things that it is doing in Ukraine right now, but it may give them a lot more second thoughts about doing something like that anywhere else, right? Knowing what the costs are. So I'm not going to sit here and tell you that sanctions are effective, but they are something that is pushing you potentially in the right direction and creating a system of costs that may eventually wear on the Russian government.
Mm-hmm. Nathan, then Lucas, and then Christopher. So maybe we can collect those three?
Sure, yeah.
So you're talking about export sanctions acting as protective tariffs,
yes,
and how that can potentially motivate a country to continue its unacceptable behavior.
Right.
Is there ever a case that, for instance, a country, for instance, the U.S., recognizes that this gives them some amount of leverage over a country that they could take away those tariffs at any point and then have the bottom fall out from under these newly created industries? Or is there a pretty simple answer, which always those countries could actually just put in protective tariffs that would compensate?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely true. I mean, countries could simply do that to themselves, and lots of countries over time have done precisely that to build up, domestic industries. South Korea, for example, built up those tariff walls, developed automobile industry, shipbuilding industry, and then dropped those tariffs and became a big international player. You can use tariffs very strategically. There's nothing stopping companies from doing that. I'm just saying that what is imposed externally like this very quickly, some people are going to make a lot of money off that. And those people then have a very powerful incentive to become politically active to make sure that the source of the revenue doesn't go away. And you're right, a country could simply just put up a protective tariff, but that's a lot more difficult to do politically usually, right? Because that's going to harm lots of people in the country. But when it's imposed on you externally, that's a different matter. So, sorry, we're going to collect questions.
No, it's okay. We can just.
I got a pen out to write them down. Okay. Sorry, who's next?
Lucas.
Yeah. So my question is, especially considering the Iran section.
Right.
If the EU does manage to find a tool for avoiding US sanctions, as for example, if a blocking Institute of 2018 manages to work, what could be the future for an effective use of sanctions? Because in this case, the EU will be able to just circumvent, and almost by direct effect, China will be able to do the same. And in the case of Iran, China and the EU are for the JCPOA, so the US effectiveness.
Right. I think you're right. I mean, that would effectively undermine it. It's not clear to me that this financial structure is going to work exactly the way people think. If it does, it would enable a lot more commercial transactions between Iran and European entities, which is where the American sort of third-party or extraterritorial sanctions kick in. We'll see how those threats work out. I mean, this to me is getting into a very legally unclear territory. The more important point, I think, is the pressure the United States is putting on Iran's buyers of oil, right? So by pretty effectively restricting the number of countries that are willing to buy Iranian oil, that's going to put a very serious dent into Iran's income and make it difficult for it to do many of the things it would want to do. So while it may have the ability to interact commercially with European companies through this financial mechanism and avoid the sanctions, national income is going to be lower, right? And so its ability to buy those things is going to be harder and harder to do. So, yeah.
Don't because cannot we see a similar case that what you mentioned in Serbia, because the Middle East is by no means like free of smuggling.
Yeah. Absolutely. Smuggling's been a big factor, and so yes, that happens there. And so, yeah, that could be a factor as well. Good point. So we'll see. That may make it all harder to change things in Iran, depending on how this works out. My main thing was to sort of focus in on not so much the effectiveness on sanctions on Iran, but rather the points of dispute between the U.S. and the EU, and where I think we can probably start to resolve some of them. But you're right, some of the counterproductive effects could occur in Iran. Just have to say no doubt.
Is it so obvious that the current US administration is the status quo power? Because it's walked out of the Paris Climate Change Agreement, it's walked out of the Iran Agreement, it's used the threat of walking out to rewrite the NAFTA Agreement. Yep. Instead of using the WTO dispute mechanism, it's threatening and imposing tariffs on China. I mean, it looks as if the US agreements are valid until the election of the next president.
Well, that's true of any agreement that's not run through the Senate, right?
Which is virtually all of them at the moment. Which is virtually all of them at the moment, given the difficulty of getting two-thirds majority.
Right. So when you do that, yes, you're at the mercy of the next president, right? So if it is an issue that's simply, I mean, I think any Republican administration probably would have pulled out of the Paris Climate Agreement. NAFTA, I mean, I think there's an enormous amount of bluster in this administration, right? When you sort of look at the statements and the way things are conducted, it is radically different, right? When you actually look what actually gets done, it's not as much different. And I'll just point out, I mean, for a long time, people have been talking about there has to be adjustments to NAFTA, right? 25-year-old agreement, it's time to come back and sort of think about some of these things. A few points that were kind of labeled up there as things that had to be dealt with. I think any administration coming up would have quietly started to address those. Quietly is the critical point, right? That's not the approach of this administration, which is to essentially throw hand grenades out in the middle of the room, watch them blow up, and then, take credit for blowing the smoke away, right? I mean, that seems to be sort of the modus operandi here. For example, the U.S.-EU trade dispute over tariff issues and threatening to impose tariffs on EU over car import tariffs, right? It's an issue that other American administrations have flagged before. I would expect it would be addressed at some level, right? But the way in which it's being addressed, which is provoke a crisis, turn it into a huge issue, and then, play the theater of it rather than simply a quiet, behind-the-scenes bureaucratic negotiation, which is how it would happen in most situations. This is what I think is emblematic about this administration. So I don't see it as this sort of game changer in policy. I see it as a game disruptor in style, and oftentimes in a way which I think is highly lacking in strategic thinking. I think a lot of good arguments can be made for the American approach towards China on intellectual property at this point. Other administrations have been making the same point, right? That this has got to change. And reaching into tariffs to try and do that is obviously a controversial point. But to me, if you're going to do that, if you're going to go that route, then the sane and logical thing to do is line up your ducks behind you or in a row with you, right? So your other major trading partners with China, like the EU, get them all on board with this, minimize any disputes you have with them, and then put the pressure on, as opposed to this sort of offense, tout azimuth kind of strategy. So, or lack of strategy. So, I see it. I see your point exactly, and I've heard this voice before, but I think there is a sense of renegotiating some of the basic fundamental points of American involvement in certain institutions and the cost that it bears for them, and doing it in a very transactional way, which I think is highly short-sighted. I'm not sure I see it as so disrupting the status quo in the sense of establishing a stable and predictable environment, but one that is more suited to current American interests. I think that's what it's trying to do. But the way in which they're going about it, to me, is problematic, to put it mildly. So, I don't know if that answers your question, but
Okay. Do we have additional questions? Because I have one question which was more theoretical.
Sure.
Because those groups, some of you, we already had those discussions about Russia. Hypothetically, thinking about the end of sanctions. Mm-hmm. And when you tie the sanctions into the policy change, and the policy change doesn't happen, what the history teaches us, how it was looking like previously? Can you give us some examples when there was a withdrawal of the sanctions without destroying credibility of actor, and in a situation that it is pretty clear that this policy change is not going to happen?
Okay, so you raise a really important point, and one which I remember very clearly some debates that we had in the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, because we expelled Russia at one point. And this actually went back to the invasion of Georgia and all of that, so 2008. So, boom, Russia, you're out. But the objectionable things that were occurring never really changed, right? So, at what point do we let them back in? Does it just become that we kick them out forever? Well, what's the point of having an international organization to be able to discuss things with not just the states you like, but the ones you don't like, right? If you want to have that ability to have discussion and the value of that, then don't we need to bring them back in? No, the same discussion occurs, and this will happen, I'm sure, very shortly on this issue with sanctions on Russia. How long do you maintain this policy if it's not really getting you what you want directly, and it's costing you, and people adjust and find ways around it? Does it just become the new status quo, and that's just what it is? Or does it eventually sort of wither away? And the history of most sanctions over time is that they do wither away, right? So sanctions on Iraq, for example, after the 1991 Persian Gulf War, very, very strict at first. They gradually start to just kind of wither away, and other countries find ways around them, and there's all sorts of mechanisms that come in. These things tend to melt over time, right? And I think any state that is under international sanctions realizes that rather quickly, and time is to some extent on their side. So, yes, the effectiveness of sanctions oftentimes fades, both because people become adjusted, find other ways around it, and there's just fatigue after a while by the states that are imposing them. So.
Okay, we have Lucas. We still have like a few minutes.
Okay, so now my question is instead of Iran, going back to Russia.
Okay.
So, my question, especially connected with this idea of do they work or not, because one thing that I found that you didn't mention was the fact that which are the preferences for the targeted player. Right. So if me as a state, I don't care that much about the economy, then the sanctions are not going to be that powerful. And my question then would be, because you were mentioning about how Russia may lose its market share in terms of energy, but with some countries it holds 100% of dependencies, such as Hungary lost the with some countries were 100%. And in this case, if the US does manage to win back market share, it wouldn't be surprising to Gazprom just try to on purpose lower their prices, even if they cost them, because they don't look for profit, they look for influence.
That could happen. I mean, you have to understand that American companies they're not government owned. They don't have that option, right? They're not going to be subsidized by the U.S. government to do these things. So it's simply going to be a matter of, I think, over time, given the technological developments and the economies of scale in the United States, the cost of production is going down, right? Because Russia can't get international investment into its infrastructure to modernize it. It's breaking down. It's getting older. It's getting weaker. Those costs are not going to go down. They're probably going to go up somewhat. So at some point, the cost differential becomes pretty minor. At which point, Russian influence through gas exports is likely to diminish. Right? Its ability to leverage that for political power is likely to go down, not up.
Yeah, but again, the problem of my question in itself was, how would a sanction work against a country which doesn't necessarily have the same economic mentality as the US?
I see. Okay, where they're not valuing these things. Well, okay. So you're right. You can construct a rational actor model with whatever preferences you want, right? And you can assume a rational economic actor puts certain preferences above others. But what if they don't, right? What if they're willing to bear enormous costs for some political reason? Is sort of what you're saying. That can be there, but you're still imposing costs on them. And those costs are going to cut into the funds that they have available to do a whole range of other activities, right? Whether it is development of their military, whether it is funding, breakaway groups in different parts of the states of the former Soviet Union, whether it is whatever, sort of mischievous activities that the Russian government oftentimes involves itself in the periphery of Russia. So I think there's a resource question there that's important to address, is that you're constraining resources in a way that, it may not change things, but it forces people to make harder decisions, right? You're imposing costs. So once again, it doesn't necessarily change everything, right? But if your options are limited, this is one way to sort of force things in a direction that you want to get to. It may not work, but at least it's sort of pushing you down that road. Because once again, what's your other option? Right? You want to start a war with Russia? Yeah, nobody does.
Who said that?
Okay, well, we got one volunteer.
Yeah, we have some volunteers.
Okay.
Okay, last chance for last question. Okay. Join me with thanking Professor Zeldin for this wonderful lecture. Thank you very much. Thank you for being here for this lecture, and enjoy your non-rainy afternoon. It's a change in a while. No, they were very self-constraining. So they just, it's always me, they just keep discussing it. Nothing can support it, but out from this room, because there's probably next class. I'm sorry. You guys are staying here for the next class? No. Yes, you have class. What time? Quarter to 5. That's fine. So we can,
work our way out.
He makes me think
yeah, we can talk afterwards if you want. No, just we just work while we get time for it.
What's the issue?
Oh, okay.
Yeah, we have to so we get.
Always have to check it.